Thank you very much, Morgane and Margit, for this invitation. I'm really happy to be here today. So in this presentation, I will try to give a quick overview of the situation in France when it comes to media art conservation, and to show how the situation is evolving and what changes we can hope to witness in the years to come. So I will talk of the institutional field, but I actually am myself not working internally in the institutions that I will mention, since I am rather an independent researcher or freelance conservator working periodically on projects for these institutions. So I might not always have the same precision as someone who works inside each of these teams. Actually, part of the new media department of Centre Pompidou is present in the room today. So Marcel Lalista, chief curator of the department, and Anaïs Brive and Sylvie Doigt-Labelle, who are assistant curators and in charge of the single channel works and installation collections, are here. So don't hesitate to ask more precisions after if you want. Also, I will obviously not mention all institutions, far from it. And for instance, the field of archives and libraries, although many things are going on about electronic media conservation at the National Library of France already since the 1990s, for instance. However, I will try to give the perspective on the French field that grants the fact to be involved with several museums, at the same time then doing research on conservation. The French public collections of media art are mostly comprised of the Centre Pompidou, so the Musée National d'Art Moderne collection, the Centre National des Arts Plastiques, CNAP, the city contemporary art museums such as the Musée d'Art Moderne de Paris or the CAPC in Bordeaux, for instance, and the numerous FRAC, which are regional contemporary art collections, as well as some departmental institutions such as Espace Multimédia Gantner, and some municipal ones such as the Fonds Municipal d'Art Contemporain de Paris. Of course, the Centre Pompidou being one of the earliest media art collections internationally and one of the largest with its 3,000 artworks, it exceeds by far the amount of artworks from all other museums on the territory, and has many specificities such as the presence of very old formats and careers due to its starts in the 70s, 1976 in fact. Most of other media art collections in France started in the mid-80s or in the late 80s and are comprised of a majority of artworks from the 1990s or the 2000s. The FRAC collections generally include approximately 100 video or media artworks, but since there are 23 FRAC across the territory, the totality of the FRAC network represents around 2,000 media artworks. The main initial observation when looking at the conservation status of these media art collections is certainly its disparity. It is a multiple speed situation in which many of the institutions are still on the process of installing basic collection management procedures adapted for time-based media artworks, or some are barely starting the digitization of their collection of videotapes, while others are already painstakingly fine-tuning their procedures, have already an adapted documentation system, equipment monitoring, and acquisition forms. Except for the Espace Multimédia Gantner collection of digital artworks, and except for the Centre Pompidou, where the digitization of the video collection started already 15 years ago, most of the collections have started this process very recently or are starting it right now. And it frequently serves as a first step to begin reflecting on the sustainability and preservation of their media art collection. In most of the regional institutions like FRAC, there is no collection manager specially in charge of video or media artworks, and the staff is unprepared to deal with technological artworks, even if some now start to train to gain better knowledge on it in the recent years. This results in a great disparity between the existing preservation procedures in Centre Pompidou, for instance, where qualified staff exists for audiovisual media, and the procedures in smaller collections. However, one element is consistent. Budgets officially labeled as conservation, such as the ones for painting and sculpture, generally don't exist for media art collections, for which the budgets are most of the time only regarded as digitization costs, as they would be for a library. And, as a consequence, in-depth case studies of media artworks are still very scarce. In her 2013 article, Emerging Institutional Models and Notions of Expertise for the Conservation of Time-Based Media, Pip Lawrenson describes the French model as being its own category. Amongst the different historical models in conservation, the new media department of Centre Pompidou is described as a specialist curatorial department where the curators retain responsibility for the conservation of the time-based media artworks. This remains mostly true today, as opposed to institutions where a conservation department specialized in time-based media exists in-house, with dedicated researchers, conservators, or technicians. But, as we will see, this situation has evolved in recent years. As you might know, it is frequent in France that conservation tasks, when it is preventive conservation, that is, are carried out or supervised by professionals of collection management, such as attachés de conservation, or sometimes by registrars in smaller institutions. The word conservateur itself is mostly used to qualify curators or head of collections, thus reinforcing the importance of their role in supervising conservation policies and actions, while the word restaurateur is used for conservators. Traditionally in France, conservators or conservation departments did not exist for the field of video and media art, largely due to the fact that the tasks falling under preventive conservation, such as condition assessment, documentation, and equipment management, were taken care of by collection managers. And the curative conservation tasks, such as equipment maintenance and repair, as well as digitization, for instance, were handled by engineers, specialized technicians, or production labs, so externally and only occasionally. With the absence of a specific course or degree in media art conservation in the art conservation schools, and with the scarcity of in-depth conservation case studies on media artworks, the need for a conservator figure who would play a role of expertise, coordinator, and interface between museum professionals and engineers or technicians did not become obvious until quite recently, let's say in the past 10 years. So there are no museums in France where conservators specialized in time-based media work in-house. But conservation tasks in the broad sense for media art collections are handled internally in most institutions, with the help of freelance specialists on certain occasions, mostly when it involves technical tasks or engineering, whether it is in the analog or digital technologies field. In recent years, several ongoing changes have made this situation evolve. Part of it is a direct consequence of technological obsolescence in the industry. It is the decreasing amount of technicians qualified on obsolete technologies inside the production teams and laboratories that once were a cornerstone of conservation procedures in our museums, such as the audiovisual production department of Centre Pompidou, for instance. With a primary mission being production on current digital media, being involved in obsolete technologies and equipment maintenance, or even in digitization, has progressively disappeared from their policy, which threatens the access to a precious technical expertise for collection managers. Same goes for external digitization labs, primarily working for the industry of production, even when they collaborate only periodically with archives and museums. Another part is due to the increasing need of case-specific conservation actions for complex media artworks in order to be able to keep on exhibiting them, with time passing and obsolescence of equipment becoming more and more of a direct threat. This might sound obvious in our context today, but in a situation in which even much broader conservation procedures, such as digitization campaigns or sustainable archival on servers, are still ongoing and far from being achieved in most of French institutions because of shortages of staff and budget, well, the priority could not be case-by-case conservation actions. Most of the time, the main required tasks in order to get the artwork functioning in the exhibition room were done by technicians from the production team without the time for research on sustainability or in-depth documentation to anticipate future actions. This is also what I think is starting to change. As an example of this, I will take a few moments to show you a very important conservation project that has been going on in the past 4 years, in fact, in the form of a case study. In 2019, the Centre Pompidou initiated a 1-year-long research project for the conservation of one of the major artworks in the history of the media art collection. This piece is a multimedia installation titled Zapping Zone by the filmmaker, photographer, writer, and computer artist Chris Marker. It was produced by the Centre Pompidou in 1990 for their first exhibition entirely dedicated to the overlaps between video, computer images, and photography, Passage de l'image, created by Christine Van Asch, Raymond Bellour, and Catherine David. The installation is comprised of 19 CRT monitors, including video monitors as well as computer monitors, 6 Apple II GS units, 20 photographic prints, and 4 light boxes with 35mm color slides in them. It was frequently modified between 1990 and 1994 in terms of content as much as spatial arrangement, thus blurring what was its reference condition, or even if a reference condition existed at all. In addition, its equipment as well as its carriers, the COT monitors primarily, and the Apple II computers and their floppy disks, had become increasingly obsolete and failing, even if the work had been exhibited many times until the years 2010s. Thanks to Marcel Lalista, chief curator of the new media department of the museum, funding was found to undertake a 1-year conservation study involving 2 external researchers, Agnès de Cailleux, who is a digital artist and had previously worked on the conservation of other computer works by Chris Marker, and myself. It was funded by the Science and Heritage Foundation, Fondation des Sciences et du Patrimoine, which belongs to the Ministry of Culture, so it was public funding, and involved a partnership with the Center for Research and Restoration of the Museums of France, the C2RMF, thanks to Cécile Dazor, who some of you might know as she is the curator and researcher who started very early on to tackle the issue of technological obsolescence in contemporary art conservation in France in the 2000s. Actually, most of what I am presenting today would not have occurred without the work that she did at C2RMF from 2006 onwards. The possible depth that granted such an unusual duration for a conservation study was, to my knowledge at least, a novelty for the French media art field. To quickly summarize the main tasks that were undertaken, research was led into all the existing archive documents about the production of the work in 1990 and each of its exhibitions. Discussions and interviews were conducted with many of the people involved in the production at the time or who were close to Chris Marker. Many exchanges took place with specialists of Apple II computers, communities of people still working on maintaining this equipment today, engineers and technicians, but also communities of amateurs. Extensive documentation was made for all the images displayed on their original technologies, and X-ray and photo documentation were undertaken at the C2RMF lab for one of the Apple II GS units. And mostly, the installation was reconstructed and exhibited a year later, thanks to the help of the museum team and the maintenance and repair of all the equipment by 2 engineers. The choice was made for this exhibition to focus on the 1990 first iteration of the installation, as it was seen in the exhibition Passage de l'Image originally. The work is actually still exhibited right now for over a year now, even a year and a half, and has been undergoing many maintenance operations, meaning the 1-year project extended in some ways in recent years with a lot of additional talks and work sessions with the museum team. Of course, such a conservation study is an exception in terms of time and means, and obviously not any artwork from the media art collections in French museums can benefit from such a treatment. But that doesn't mean the generalization of such a case-specific approach is impossible, at least to a certain extent. The Zapping Zone case study actually was, in some way, the follow-up of other case studies conducted in the previous years with other institutions, including the FRAC Franche-Comté, for instance, with a case study on the installation Becoming Visible by Marina Abramovic from 1993, initiated also by Cécile Dazor. This study was the first step of an investigation on the state of the art of CRT conservation in 2016. That led to other case studies on the same collection at the FRAC, some of which are still going on, including pieces by Pierrick Sorin, for instance. Another example is a study from 2018 for the Musée d'Art Moderne de Paris, where we worked on the conservation of Olympe de Gouges Van Nam June Pike. These studies were all conducted together with the engineer Pierre-Alain Fardel, who also worked on the Zapping Zone equipment. You see him here adjusting the last failing monitor on the piece before its exhibition in 2018. In these situations, the role I play as a conservator is not one of someone technically qualified on all technologies, far from it, but rather the role of interface between the museum and the engineers and specialized technicians, trying to speak both languages, to document, to investigate, and reflect in order to frame each decision between what is gained and what is lost. In the end, even if such conservation studies can be difficult to set up time-wise and budget-wise, they don't only benefit the artwork, but they also benefit the field. For instance, many elements that were researched during the zapping zone study were not only benefiting from previous actions that were led in other French institutions, such as the floppy disk conservation plan that was undertaken by Morgan at the Chris Marker Archive at the French Cinémathèque, but mostly many of these elements are being useful right now for other artworks in the collection. I'm thinking primarily of the conservation of another media artwork by Chris Marker produced later in 1997 on CD-ROM titled eMemory, which is going on at the moment at Centre Pompidou. Most of the methods we are using to extract the original content created in a software called HyperStudio. It's the earliest multimedia creation software for Apple computers developed by a friend of Chris Marker, actually, Roger Wagner. So most of these extraction methods came from the research on Zapping Zone. Even more broadly, the structure and content of an archive folder for a media artwork in the museum's archive has been influenced by this research, or the documentation procedures, the database system, etc. With what has been going on in France in the past 10 years, the field might be evolving slightly away from what Pip Lawrenson had described in 2013 and towards what she mentions in that same article as the model of the San Francisco MoMA, which is a cross-disciplinary model where an internal team is developed to respond collaboratively to the needs of time-based media artworks, including conservators, registrars, technicians, curators, and legal representatives, plus any additional freelance specialists. To conclude, I think after having the opportunity to work on such a long study in the past years, the observation that we made together with the museum team as a lesson from this research is that the vast majority of the decisions that were made about the conservation of the work, as well as the actions that were undertaken to preserve it in its complexity for the future, would not have been possible without such a context, such means, and time for an in-depth case study. As the collection manager of the New Media Installations, Sylvie Douat-Labelle, told us at the end of the research in a discussion, it's important for museum professionals involved in the daily rhythm of exhibitions and emergencies to touch upon the fact that there are different temporalities, the temporality of daily collection care and the temporality of case-specific research. These two, and this will be my conclusion, obviously have to coexist in a system that can fit both, and that is what we can wish to happen more in the future in the French museums. Thank you.